China spent $20 billion building a world-class high-speed railway through one of the poorest, most landlocked nations on Earth, and it is quietly rewriting global trade routes. This is not a story about generosity. It is the opening move in the most consequential infrastructure game of the 21st century. Since opening, this single railway has already recorded 62.5 million passenger trips in a country of just 7 million people. That is 9 train trips for every single living Laotian. You heard that right. And once you see what China is actually building toward, you will never look at a map of Southeast Asia the same way again. But to understand why this railway changes everything, you first need to feel what Laos looked like before a single meter of it existed. What Laos was before this railway existed. Imagine trying to build a business in a country where the roads dissolve into mud every monsoon season, where the rivers that cut through your land run the wrong direction for trade, where the mountains surrounding you are not a backdrop, they are a prison wall. That is the Laos you need to picture before any of this makes sense. Laos sits in the dead center of mainland Southeast Asia, landlocked, hemmed in on every side by China to the north, Vietnam to the east, Cambodia to the south, and Thailand and Myanmar to the west. No coastline, no deep-water port, no flat corridor wide enough to build the kind of transport infrastructure that turns a nation into an economic player. Every single neighboring country had something Laos did, not an exit, a way to plug into the maritime trade routes that built the wealth of modern Asia. And that absence had a price. Farmers in the northern highlands grew produce that rotted before it reached a market worth selling to. Foreign manufacturers, the kind that transformed Vietnam and Thailand into export powerhouses, never seriously considered Laos as a location because the logistics were essentially unsolvable. Getting goods in was expensive. Getting goods out was even worse. The country wasn't poor because its people lacked ambition. It was poor because geography had locked it out of the game entirely. There is actually a phrase development economists used to describe exactly this situation. They called it being landlocked, not land-linked. It sounds academic until you understand what it meant in practice. Laos was surrounded by commerce it could never fully participate in. It could see the prosperity being built on its borders. It just had no way to reach it. For decades, no credible solution existed. The geography hadn't changed. The mountains were still there. The borders were exactly where they had always been. But then something moved. Something large, expensive, and entirely unexpected. And it did not move around the mountains. It went straight through them. The engineering impossibility. Here is what China was actually proposing to build: a 1,000-kilometer railway through some of the most mountainous, inaccessible, geologically unforgiving terrain in all of Southeast Asia. In 5 years, in a country that barely had roads. Every regional government watching this project assumed it would stall. They had seen ambitious infrastructure announcements before. They knew what the terrain looked like. They did the math on the timeline and quietly decided it was not serious. They were wrong. Because China did not send a planning committee. It sent 100,000 construction workers at peak deployment. It did not wait for obstacles to be resolved. Before moving to the next phase, it removed the obstacles from the schedule entirely and kept building. The approach was not cautious or methodical in the way that large infrastructure projects typically are. It was relentless in a way that genuinely unsettled the engineers and government officials in neighboring countries who were tracking it. But before a single worker could bore a single tunnel, there was a problem that had nothing to do with mountains. Laos is the most heavily bombed country per capita in human history. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laotian soil during the Vietnam War, much of it in the very northern corridor where the railway needed to go. Decades later, an estimated 30% of those munitions never detonated. They simply sat in the ground, waiting. Construction crews did not lay track first. They cleared bombs first. Let that settle for a moment. The opening act of building one of Southeast Asia's most advanced railways was disposing of 50-year-old unexploded warheads buried in jungle terrain that had never been fully mapped. That is the sentence that reframes the entire scale of what you are looking at. And then came the mountains. 75 tunnels bored through solid limestone ranges, hundreds of bridges thrown across river gorges and valleys. When the final numbers were counted, approximately 60% of the railway's total length was either underground or elevated, meaning for more than 600 kilometers. The train is not running across Laos, it is running through it and above it. Entire mountain communities were negotiated with, compensated, and relocated. Temporary access roads were constructed purely to reach construction sites that had no roads. Supply chains were built from scratch in terrain where supply chains had never existed before. And it was done in 5 years, on schedule. The regional governments that had quietly doubted the timeline stopped doubting it on December 2, 2021, when the first train departed on time. But here is what none of the engineering coverage told you. The staggering numbers this railway started producing the moment it opened are only half the story. The numbers that arrived: 62.5 million passenger trips, 72.5 million tons of cargo, 3,000 distinct product categories moving across a single rail line through a country of 7 million people. These are not projections, these are not targets. These are the numbers the Laos-China Railway produced after it opened, and they landed like a quiet earthquake in every trade ministry across Southeast Asia. Start with the passengers. 62.5 million trips in a country where the entire population could fit inside a single mid-sized Chinese city. You are not looking at Laotian commuters filling those seats. You are looking at cross-border movement that this country was physically incapable of generating before December 2021. Students, traders, tourists, and logistics workers flowing through a corridor that did not exist 3 years earlier. Now look at the cargo side, because this is where the real story lives. 72.5 million tons across 3,000 product categories tells you something critical. This is not a single commodity line built to extract one resource and ship it north. This is a functioning general-purpose trade corridor, already operating at genuine scale. Tropical fruit from northern Laos arriving in Kunming fresh, within hours, instead of rotting over days on a broken road. Chinese electronics and machinery moving south at a speed and cost that sea freight simply cannot match for mid-volume, time-sensitive goods. The Vientiane Freight Terminal, built from nothing, is now processing international cargo that connects China's interior to markets it could not previously reach by land. And here is the thing that should stop you cold. These numbers describe what the railway is doing right now, in its early years, before the rest of the network it was designed to connect has even been completed. Because this railway was never actually built for Laos. The actual game. Pull up a map of Southeast Asia. Find Laos. Trace the railway line from Boten, right at the Chinese border in the north, all the way down to Vientiane, the Lao capital in the south. Now keep going. Because the railway does not stop at Vientiane psychologically, even though the tracks currently do. Vientiane sits kilometers from the Mekong River. On the other side of that river is Nong Khai, Thailand. And Thailand is not a dead end. Thailand is Bangkok. And Bangkok is one of the most strategically positioned cities in all of Southeast Asia. Here is where you need to pay very close attention. Thailand is already building its connecting segment northward. The Thai-Chinese high-speed rail project linking Bangkok toward the Lao border is not a proposal sitting in a government folder somewhere. It is under active construction, and the moment that link completes, something happens that no amount of maritime reshuffling can replicate. You get a single unbroken rail corridor running from Kunming deep inside China's landlocked Yunnan province, through Botan, through Luang Prabang, through Vientiane, across the Mekong, through Bangkok, and continuing south through Malaysia all the way to Singapore. Kunming to Singapore, roughly 3,000 kilometers, by land, by rail. 600 million people connected along a single corridor running through the fastest growing economic region on Earth. You heard that right, 600 million people, linked by the spine of a trade network that did not exist 5 years ago and is being completed right now, section by section, while most of the world is focused elsewhere. And Laos' tiny, landlocked, mountainous Laos is the hinge the entire corridor swings on. Without the Laos section, there is no continuous land route. The gap between China's southern border and Thailand's northern reach was the one missing piece that made a true Pan-Asian rail corridor impossible for decades. China did not build a railway to Laos. China built the hinge and placed it inside Laos. But why Laos specifically? Why not a coastal route? Why spend $20 billion threading rail through the most difficult terrain in the region when easier options existed on paper? To answer that, you need to understand what China was actually trying to solve, and it has nothing to do with tourism. The inland coast. What China was actually solving. Yunnan province sits in China's deep southwest. No coastline, no ocean access, no natural exit to the sea lanes that carry the world's cargo. While China's coastal provinces, Guangdong, Zhejiang, Fujian, built themselves into the engine room of global manufacturing precisely because ships could dock at their doorstep, Yunnan sat behind mountains, with nowhere to send what it produced at competitive speed or cost. The railway gave Yunnan something geography had denied it for centuries: a southern exit. Goods manufactured or assembled anywhere in Yunnan can now move south through Laos, into Thailand, and reach Southeast Asian consumers faster and cheaper than routing through China's coastal ports ever allowed. That single change quietly rewrites Yunnan's economic identity from landlocked interior province to the southern gateway of the world's largest trading nation. But there is a second problem China was solving, and this one is far more serious. Roughly 80% of China's oil imports travel through the Strait of Malacca, a narrow shipping choke point squeezed between Malaysia and Indonesia, barely 2.5 miles wide at its narrowest point. That is an extraordinarily dangerous dependency for any nation, but for a country of China's scale and global ambitions, it is a strategic vulnerability that military planners have been quietly alarmed about for decades. In any serious conflict or naval standoff, a rival power could effectively strangle China's energy supply by controlling a stretch of water you could throw a stone across. China does not control the Strait of Malacca. It never has. And it cannot build its way out of that geography in the ocean. But it can build its way around it on land. An overland rail corridor running south through Laos and Thailand does not eliminate the Malacca dependency overnight. Maritime freight volumes are simply too large for rail to replace entirely. But it creates something China has never had in this region before: an alternative. A land-based logistics route into Southeast Asian markets that does not pass through a choke point it cannot defend. That is not infrastructure. That is strategic architecture. And the moment those trains started running on schedule, every factory owner, every trade minister, and every freight operator in Southeast Asia began asking the same uncomfortable question: what does this railway actually do to us? The factory floor reshuffles. Manufacturing does not move randomly. It follows cost. And the single largest component of cost in any supply chain is not labor, it is logistics. How long does it take to move a product from where it is made to where it is sold? How much does that journey cost? How predictably does it arrive? When the answers to those questions change significantly, factories move. And right now, across Southeast Asia, those answers are changing. The most immediate winners are the farmers. Northern Laos, the highland regions of northern Thailand, and the agricultural zones of Yunnan province all produce tropical fruit, vegetables, and specialty crops that Chinese consumers want and are increasingly willing to pay premium prices for. Before this railway, that produce faced an almost insurmountable logistics problem. The roads were unreliable, the journey was long, and by the time a shipment of fresh lychees or dragon fruit arrived in a Kunming market, it was either barely sellable or already lost. The railway collapsed that problem entirely. Fresh produce from northern Laos now reaches southern Chinese markets in hours, not days, hours. That is not a marginal improvement in someone's profit margin. That is the creation of an entirely new agricultural economy for hundreds of thousands of farmers who previously had no competitive market to sell into. But now, turn the flow around and watch what happens in the other direction. Chinese electronics, consumer goods, and industrial machinery are already moving south at speeds and costs that maritime freight cannot match for mid-volume shipments. This deepens Chinese commercial penetration into markets that were already buying Chinese products: Thailand, Malaysia, and eventually Singapore, but were doing so primarily through sea routes that added time, cost, and complexity. The railway removes that friction. And when friction disappears in trade, volume accelerates. For Vietnam, watching this corridor take shape from the outside, the calculation is uncomfortable. Vietnam built its export economy on maritime access and careful diversification away from Chinese infrastructure dependency. It has not joined this corridor. Its absence is a deliberate geopolitical statement and a bet that sea lanes remain more valuable than the land route being assembled on its western border. That bet may be right, but it may not be. Because the bigger disruption this railway is triggering is not about which goods move faster. It is about what Laos had to give up to make all of this possible, and the true cost of that deal is only now becoming visible. The debt architecture, what Laos actually signed. Here is where the story gets complicated. Here is where you need to hold two things in your head at the same time because both are true, and pretending one cancels out the other would be dishonest. The Laos section of this railway cost approximately $6 billion to build. Laos, a country whose entire GDP sat below $20 billion at the time of construction, was responsible for funding 30% of that. It did not have 30% of $6 billion sitting in a sovereign wealth fund. It had ambition, a geography problem it desperately needed solved, and a single credible offer on the table. So it borrowed, primarily from China Exim Bank, at terms it accepted because no alternative financing existed. The consequences arrived quickly. Laos's national debt climbed to levels that placed it firmly in the International Monetary Fund's high risk of debt distress category. A significant share of what it owed was owed to Chinese state creditors, and in 2021, the same year the railway opened. In the same months, the inaugural trains were running to international applause. Laos quietly signed over a 25-year operating lease on its national electricity grid to a Chinese state enterprise as part of a debt management arrangement. Let that land properly. The power grid, the infrastructure that keeps the lights on across the entire country. Not a single power plant, not a regional substation. The grid itself, handed over for a generation as collateral in everything but name. This is the part of the railway story that does not appear in the promotional footage. But here is where you have to hold the second truth simultaneously, because the counter-argument is not weak. No Western government was going to finance this railway. No multilateral development bank was lining up to fund a 1,000-kilometer high-speed rail line through unmapped jungle terrain, unexploded ordnance, and mountains. For a sub-investment grade borrower with no credit history for infrastructure at this scale, the European Union was not calling Vientiane. The United States had no competing offer. The Asian Development Bank's appetite for this level of risk, at this price, did not exist. China was the only entity on Earth willing to make this project happen. Whether the terms it offered were exploitative or simply reflective of the actual risk involved, that is a question economists and geopolitical analysts will argue about for decades. What is not arguable is the position Laos now occupies. It has infrastructure it could not have built alone. It has trade volumes it could not have generated before. And it has a debt it will spend the next 30 years repaying to the country that built the railway, operates the railway, and now runs its power grid. Laos has a seat at the regional trade table it never had before. The question that will define its next generation is a simple and devastating one: who actually owns that seat? And Laos is not the only country that has been handed this particular question. The larger pattern: this is not the only one. Laos did not invent this situation. It inherited a template. The Nairobi to Mombasa Railway in Kenya. The Addis Ababa to Djibouti Railway across the Horn of Africa. Rail and road networks threading through Pakistan under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Port infrastructure in Sri Lanka, where debt restructuring led to China securing a 99-year lease on the strategic Hambantota port. Roads, bridges, and rail links spreading across Cambodia, Bangladesh, and deep into Central Asia. Every project carries a different name, a different flag, a different set of announced benefits. But if you step back far enough, the architecture underneath is recognizably the same. China identifies a country with an infrastructure gap it cannot fill alone. It arrives with financing no one else is offering. It builds using its own firms, often its own labor, on timelines that embarrass every Western-backed alternative. Repayment is structured through Chinese state banks at terms that look manageable in year 1 and significantly less manageable in year 15. And when repayment becomes difficult, the renegotiation does not happen in a neutral room. It happens between a small, debt-pressured government and the largest economy on Earth. But here is what separates the Laos Railway from the version of this story that critics tell most loudly. It works. The trains run. The cargo moves. The passengers are real. The freight terminal in Vientiane is processing actual international shipments, not sitting half-built as a symbol of misaligned ambition. Across the entire Belt and Road portfolio, genuine operational success at this scale is rarer than the announcements suggest. Most projects are slower, more contested, more compromised by local politics and cost overruns than the press releases indicate. This one is not, and that makes it more consequential, not less. Because a railway that actually runs is a railway that actually binds. Every ton of cargo that moves through it, every loan repayment that flows back toward Beijing, every operating agreement that gets renewed, each one tightens the architecture that China built not just through Laos, but around an entire region. The question is not whether this pattern exists. You can see it on a map. The question is what happens to the countries inside it and what they can actually do about it. One loan repayment at a time. Come back to the image you started with. A train cutting through mountains that had never held a railway, carriages, climate-controlled, and running on time. Freight terminals processing thousands of product categories in a country that, less than a decade ago, had 7 kilometers of functioning rail connecting to nothing. None of that is illusion. None of it is propaganda. The engineering is real. The cargo tonnage is real. The passenger numbers are real. The farmers watching their produce arrive in Kunming fresh instead of rotting on a broken road, they are real. And for them, for the citizens riding between Laos cities in hours instead of days, for a government that can point to something visible and modern and say, this exists, the railway delivered something that genuinely matters. But here is the tension that does not resolve neatly. Here is the question you carry out of this story. Laos now has a seat at the regional trade table it was locked out of for its entire modern history. Geography, poverty, and the absence of infrastructure all excluded it. That exclusion is over. The railway ended it. And that outcome is genuinely significant for a nation that had no realistic path to it through any other means. But a seat at a table is only as valuable as the leverage you hold while sitting in it. And leverage is precisely what debt erodes slowly, quietly, one repayment cycle at a time. The loan schedules run for decades. The power grid lease runs for 25 years. The operating agreements that govern how revenue flows through the railway, who controls its systems, who sets its freight priorities, those terms were written by the entity that financed the project. They will be renegotiated by the same entity from the same position of structural advantage every time they come up for review. China can build another railway. Laos cannot unbuild this one. And that asymmetry, that quiet, permanent imbalance between the country that needed the infrastructure and the country that provided it is the real story, buried beneath every headline about tunnels and bridges and record cargo volumes. When the Pan-Asian corridor eventually completes, when a single train can run unbroken from Kunming all the way to Singapore through 600 million people's economies, it will be called one of the great infrastructure achievements of the 21st century. It will be studied, celebrated, and ridden by hundreds of millions of people who will have no particular reason to think about who financed the tunnels beneath them or what was signed away to make those tunnels possible. The $20 billion was never charity. It was never generosity. It was a down payment carefully structured, strategically placed, and designed to compound on something far larger than a railway. And the receipts are still being written.